What are 9 critical mistakes you should never make in world building? This is a question I stumbled upon on YouTube in the video to which you will find the link attached in the description below. And since I consider world building one of my specialties, I was of course intrigued and watched the video, and I had, let's say, mixed feelings about the points the creator was making and thought I will make a reply for it. So, welcome to Mythcritic. I'm a content creator from Germany and my channel is mostly devoted to fantasy literature. I also do some sci-fi, a little bit every now and then about movies and series, but the main focus is fantasy literature. My content normally is in German, so if you're one of my German viewers and you're confused why I'm speaking English now, I just thought it's very unfair to make a reaction video to an English video and not give the creator the chance to reply to it, because most likely he won't understand what I'm saying. So this one will be in English, but we have subtitles all the way in German, so don't fret if your English isn't that great. And if you're from the English-speaking world, if you're new to my channel, if you happen to speak German, of course, please check out my videos. And if you don't, I might do some more content in English in the future. An American author has approached me, has sent me his book, award-nominated author, and I thought, okay, if he goes through all that trouble to reach out to me all the way here in Germany and I'll make a review of his book, then I'll of course make it in English as well, because I of course want him to understand what I have to say about his material. So there might be some more material in English coming up in the future, so stay around. Alright, so this is not an immediate reaction. I already watched the video a while ago, so now I'm re-watching it along with you guys, so to speak, on those points where I disagree with the original creator. I am of course not trying to start an internet beef here or something. It's more like I want to start a debate. I think world building is an element to fantasy that is most often neglected in analysis of fantasy works. I feel that most critics don't have a really systematic outlook on world building. So this is something where I think we can, by a joint discussion through all the parties involved who are interested in fantasy literature, authors, critics, etc., scholars, we can elevate the level of our preferred genre if we take a closer look at it. So without further ado, let's get into the video. I'll attach the link to the original video below. We're gonna go through the whole thing, and at some points I will pause and add my thoughts to what the creator has to say.
In a 1963 letter, J.R.R. Tolkien wrote that part of the attraction of The Lord of the Rings is, I think, due to the glimpses of a large history in the background, an attraction like that of viewing far off an unvisited island, or seeing the towers of a distant city gleaming in a sunlit mist. To go there is to destroy the magic, unless new unattainable vistas are again revealed. When it comes to building your world as a fantasy writer, you can often face the temptation to try and answer every single question your reader might have, to explain every moment of history, every detail of your magic, every ancestor that led up to your main character's birth. If you feel compelled to know those details, then there is nothing wrong with that. Feel free to go ahead. Just know that you don't have to share all of that information with your reader. It's okay to leave gaps. In fact, gaps can be a feature, not a bug. I mean, what is more interesting here? I
think this is by and large a great point. Obviously, Tolkien was completely right about that. If you want to create the impression of a larger world, and since you're not God and you cannot create the world as a whole, you will have to rely on the reader's fantasy to fill the gaps, but that means you need gaps. Same goes for horror. If you want to insert elements of horror into your writing, remember Lovecraft, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the strongest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown. What your mind will, or what the reader's mind will produce, will always be much more scary than anything you can flesh out in minute detail. But I have one point I want to criticize about what he's been doing so far. He goes into a video about world building mistakes, but he never defines what he means by world building. And I think this, well, I studied philosophy, so while this would bug me anyway, even if I didn't think it was problematic for the approach this video is taking, I think as the video goes on, we're gonna see that things are lumped together under the header of world building, which don't have that much to do with it. And this first point, I would say, is ambiguous. You could call that world building, like this leaving of gaps. I would rather call it technique, a technique in presentation. If I go into too much detail, I will kind of stifle the reader's fantasy and its capacity to produce a larger image. So I'm not quite sure if I would list this first point under a world building mistake at all. But let's continue and see what else he has to say about this.
Characters from two different nations who absolutely agree on how the world was made, who the gods are, and who started which wars. Or two characters who have completely different interpretations of all of that information. You know, just like in real life, we disagree on things. That's reality. Often it is the glimpses and mystery of your world building, the stuff that you actually leave up to your reader's imagination, which creates this incredible sense of wonder and curiosity in your story. So even just a little bit of what I like to refer to as tactical inconsistency can go a long way towards making your story feel more realistic. And this actually leads to the next mistake, which I was talking about.
So, and I think here we have the crux of the matter with that first point, what he calls tactical inconsistency. This can be immensely interesting in presentation. You can have like two characters debating theology in your book, for example, and they could have widely different opinions on how the world was made and or how history played out or whatever. But this is, of course, on the level of presentation. The world building, like how it actually happened, has to be clear in your mind, in the author's mind. Otherwise, you will run into like terrible trouble down the line if you don't know what actually happened and how these inconsistencies, like in the world that you're presenting the reader with, came about. Then you will end up with total chaos, and that will be like very unsatisfying because it will break the immersion sooner or later. I like the expression, by the way, like the term he uses, technical inconsistencies, but this has to be strictly on presentation level only, while the world building itself, of course, has to be consistent.
Out with some of my fantasy outlining bootcamp students earlier this week. And this second mistake is something I call parallel world building. So let's imagine that you have all these different elements of your world and you're just kind of introducing them as their own independent things. For instance, let's say your magic system is fueled by these gemstones that you swallow. Maybe the ruling class of your story is organized into these different guilds and they each control a specific industry. Maybe there was a great rebellion 2 centuries ago that split your kingdom into 2 regions. Maybe there are these floating cities that hover over the sea in your world. So what's wrong with this picture? Well, we've got a detail about the magic over here, a detail about the society over here, something about the history over here, and then geography thing last off. And before you can say world builder's disease, you've basically overwhelmed the reader with all these different concepts, none of which relate to each other in a meaningful way. That right there is what I call parallel world building. It is basically when you introduce different things in isolation, and usually it is a big mistake.
I agree that this is a mistake. Again, I'm not sure I would call this world building. Again, we're on a level of presentation. Like the way he seems to outline it here, that seems to refer to me more as how do I, as the reader, discover the details of your world building, like the floating castles, the gemstones, the magic system. They don't exist in parallel universes in the strong sense, but they're all in one world. But the way he seems to address it as a problem here is that they are presented disjointedly. So again, I would call this more a problem of narrative technique than of actual world building. And again, we have the problem that world building hasn't been properly defined yet. That's why I wouldn't call this world building, and I will present a definition attempt toward the end of the video, so to speak, as a trump card. But let's continue and see what he has to say.
The reason is that it is hard to remember things when they are just given to you in isolation. You are much better off using what I call hub and spoke world building. So this is where you focus on making readers understand one core idea first. For example, maybe your core idea in this story is that by swallowing different gemstones, you gain different magic powers. Then once your reader understands that and they've got that detail locked in their mind, let's connect that to the society detail about how your ruling class is organized into guilds that control these specific industries. Maybe each guild actually has exclusive rights to different types of gemstones, and that's why the guild system is so powerful, and maybe they're warring with each other as a result of this. Now you can see how we have connected the magic system to the structure of this society. So the reader now understands why the guilds are important and what makes them powerful, and it all relates back to the magic. Then maybe that big rebellion we mentioned that happened 2 centuries ago, perhaps that was caused by a dispute over who should actually have access to these gemstones. So now you're tying the history directly to the magic system and the societal power structures. And then lastly, in terms of those floating cities, maybe you can link that in by saying that's where the guilds have their headquarters, or that's where their main cities are located. Can you see here, as we have linked all these different concepts together, it gives you this chain of ideas to lead readers through, where every concept actually reinforces the others, making it feel so much more cohesive and just a lot easier to hold in your head.
The second half, I completely agree with. To me, it simply means your world building should have consistency. If you have, let's say, those magic gemstones he speaks about, and they are controlled by guilds, and the guilds kind of compete against each other about these gemstones. Of course, if you have gemstones like that, that will have an impact on history. This is something that can frustrate me to no end if an element that would completely revolutionize the world as it is introduced into a fantasy world, but you cannot feel the consequences anywhere. Like if you have magic that can raise the dead, this would completely change the way our society functions. Like everything would revolve around this. And we have very few fantasy authors, I think, that really take their own ideas serious enough to actually make them palpable, so to speak, in the history and the societies they are presenting us with. So generally, I would say that is good advice, definitely.
The third common world-building mistake I see new fantasy writers make is to be trapped in present norms. Sometimes when I'm reading stories by new writers, it just feels like they create all these innovative ideas and really cool concepts, but the characters just kind of behave like modern Western people, even though the pressures that have been created by this unique world building should have probably produced some kind of different behavior within them. In other words, their values, norms, and cultural attitudes are indistinguishable from our own. Now, sometimes
this is a point I completely agree with. This was one of the reasons why I disliked Priory of the Orange Tree so much. The main character engages in a homosexual relationship in that book, and we're having a feudal society with a monotheistic religion with very strict moral norms where it's made clear that homosexuality is anathema. But when they reveal to their close friends what happened between them, their friends react like enlightened Western people and say it's your life, just be happy, whatever. And to me this is like ridiculously unbelievable that such a reaction should happen in a society like this we've been introduced to in this book. I mean, the author kind of forces upon us in this book like whom we're supposed to like. Obviously we're meant to sympathize with the heroes and with their friends, being sympathetic to their love and everything, but it's completely at odds with the world the author has introduced to us, and this completely breaks the immersion. And you're giving away so much potential character development. The characters of the friends, they could like at first struggle with that revelation, but then go through an inner process of maturation and then finally come to terms with it and come to accept it. You could do so much with that, and I think it's just sad if such opportunities are squandered. Yeah, so I think this is a real great point, and the difficulty is that if you as an author want your characters to have, for example, enlightened views on, say, homosexuality or something of that sort, you have to make an age of enlightenment happen in your world. And if you want to have your traditional feudal fantasy society as we're used in high fantasy, but you also want an age of enlightenment, you have to really know a whole lot about the history of ideas to wiggle that in there without it being completely unbelievable and forced. I would find experiments of that sort very fascinating to read, but most will by necessity kind of end up being very clumsy, because the level of knowledge that you need in the history of ideas to make something like that plausible in a fantasy world is immense. So this needs careful study and preparation if you want to do something of that sort, I think.
When you write, you are inventing your own world. And as long as you can make it feel internally believable within the context of your story, you can come up with whatever norms and cultural standards you want. It doesn't necessarily mean that you endorse or support those ideas, but to me, that is some of the most interesting territory to dig into and opens up so much room for originality.
This is a very good point he brings up here toward the end. You can work with norms you don't agree with as the author. And this can be some of the most fascinating kind of writing that happens. Because there's a beautiful and I think absolutely brilliant text by C.S. Lewis. I think it's in the collection of This and Other Worlds. It's, I think, in the short text on criticism. He takes the Coleridge idea of the willing suspension of disbelief. Coleridge says in order to enjoy literature, you have to suspend your disbelief. Like if you want to read a story about dragons, you know there are no dragons, but you have to suspend your disbelief and for the sake of literature, accept that there are dragons as long as you're in the world of the story. And C.S. Lewis twists this and says you don't only have to suspend your disbelief, but also your belief. So, for example, if I'm a religious person and I read about a brilliant atheist character, while I'm in the story, to appreciate that character, I have to become an atheist myself of sorts. And while I may have modern Western values, I can produce a fantasy world that is utterly captivating, that holds values that are not my own. And since those values that are not my own are maybe more in tune with a feudal or archaic world I'm writing about, this may feel much more natural within the confines of the story than inserting or forcing modern Western values into this fantasy setting.
This leads me to the fourth common world-building mistake I see new fantasy writers make: not writing convincing logistics. There is nothing worse than having some massive logistical error in your novel, or just getting some detail about technology or practice or something like this so absurdly wrong that it just shatters your reader's suspension of disbelief. This is...
There we have it again, the suspension of disbelief. There we go.
Certainly a mistake I have made many times in my early drafts. For example, if you look at the early drafts of Kingdom of Dragons, I wrote a scene.
I'm gonna skip a little bit of this chapter here because he describes a long conversation he had with a beta reader of his, where he wrote a hunting scene where the guy tells him that this is nothing an experienced hunter would ever do, what you're describing here. I'm quite confused by this passage. First, what does this have to do with world building? Precisely. I would just call this a sense of realism or believability. Like if I write a hunting scene, and no matter if it's in fantasy, in a historical novel, in modern realism, if I write a hunting scene, I want this hunting scene to be believable, obviously. If I write about a military campaign, I want it to be believable. It goes like for anything. This is a point I think that doesn't even need to be discussed. This is nothing specific to fantasy. If I present a certain activity, then I want it to be presented in a realistic way. And the second thing that baffles me is why does he call it logistics? When I read the title at first, I thought, okay, now I will hear something about military campaigns or trade routes or whatever, but what does a hunting scene have to do with logistics? I mean, I'm not a native English speaker, but I looked up the word. The corresponding German word is logistic. It's like the same, and I also looked it up in the dictionary in both languages. Logistics is like a part of supply chain management, basically. It can take many forms, but I'm really not sure what it has to do with the hunting scene he goes to describe. So this point left me very confused.
Now, the fifth common world-building mistake I often see new fantasy writers make is to be writing objective descriptions. When you are writing your story, in most cases, you should not be trying to write a guidebook that objectively describes your world. You are writing about a character's subjective experience of that world. You want to filter your descriptions through your character's perspective. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Here we have a kind of typical tavern scene. But let's imagine that you are describing this tavern through the perspective of a thief. What kind of details are you going to mention? Maybe the thief is going to describe...
Once again, I'm not sure what this has to do with world building. This is again a question of style, of presentation. Yes, obviously the world is always broken down into the perspective of the people inhabiting that world. That goes without saying. And since we can never take the omniscient perspective, we will always have that sort of fractured through the subjective perspectives of the characters. Yes, but to me, that's not a contradiction. I have to have the world building clear. I have to know as a fantasy author, what does my world look like in order for my characters to have realistic or believable perspectives on the world. Let's say I have a fantasy world with gods that can directly interact with the world and with their believers. Then maybe a thief who's orienting himself within a tavern, he's looking for his victim, like he could feel the hand of his god upon him and feeling particularly lucky on this day. He doesn't have to know what's happening objectively, but you as the author need to know what's happening in the big picture for the individual picture of the perspectives of the characters to be believable and realistic and not contradict the big picture. To me, the two perspectives, the objective big picture perspective and the individual perspectives, they require each other. They're not at odds, or if they are at odds, you have a huge problem. So yeah, I'm not sure why this is set up as this big contradiction, obviously. And I've seen that as well. Like many authors will fall into the trap that they are writing rulebook texts. They've read so many role-playing rulebooks where the world building is just not broken through the individual perspectives of characters, but it's all objectively stated. Okay, so this god did that, this god did that. In a novel, this is of course, like if you did that, that would be horribly boring and almost unreadable. So if it's that he's referring to, then this is where I could see that this is a problem. But again, this is not a world-building mistake in and of itself. That would be a stylistic mistake.
The fact that, oh, it looks kind of dark over in that corner, so that's probably going to be the easiest place to pickpocket some stuff from people. These patrons don't look particularly wealthy. Maybe I should move on to some other place and try my luck there. Maybe I can go up to this table and become friends with those 4 people over there, get them all drunk, and then maybe go back to one of their houses afterwards and hope that there's more valuable things for me to steal there. So you can see here how the description of this tavern has been filtered through the thief's perspective. That tells you a lot about the character's personality. But let's now imagine that your perspective character is a young farm boy who has never really visited the big city before. They've never really spent a lot of time in taverns. How would that character describe this location? Maybe they think about the fact that, oh, it's really noisy in here, or everyone's shouting at each other, and oh, the floor is sticky. What is this? This is kind of disgusting. And oh, there's someone playing music over there, though. Ah, that's kind of exciting. Oh, why is this person, leaning on me with horrible breath breathing into my ear? Oh, they must be drunk. And you can see here.
This is, for me, something that has nothing to do with world building. It has to do with realism. Like, if I have characters from different parts of the world, they will, of course, experience a place differently. Like, when the hobbits come to Bree, the place is, especially for people like Sam, who have never left Hobbiton or a 20-mile radius or something around Hobbiton, this is a big and somewhat intimidating place. If Tolkien had chosen to show us Strider's perspective in The Prancing Pony, from his perspective it would look completely different, and it would be unrealistic if he had like the same sort of impressions like the hobbits. That goes without saying. But This is just a way of writing realistic characters. This is not specific to fantasy. If I wrote a historical novel or a modern realist novel, I would be faced with exactly the same problem. This is nothing specific to fantasy, and I think world building is something that is very specific to fantasy, or let's say to speculative fiction, which is the overarching genre of horror, sci-fi, and fantasy.
How that description is also telling us a lot about the person who is entering this setting. In many ways, this is actually the secret to getting your world building across effectively in your story. You want to think about the world building and your descriptions not just as a tool to describe your setting, but as a way to reflect your character and also to progress your plot as well. The more interconnectedness you can have here, where every description of your world also advances our understanding of your main point of view character and maybe hints at some conflicts that are going to come in the plot later on, the more cohesive it's going to feel, and the less it's going to feel like you're writing a info dump. And you may even get to the point where readers just love the perspective your character has when they describe aspects of your world, that you can kind of throw your character into any scenario and they're going to describe it in a really interesting way.
So the last bit of that passage is good advice. I completely agree with him there. We don't want info dumps. We want to get to know all these aspects in an interconnected way that makes it much more interesting. Like, I completely agree there. I don't think it has to do with world building in the strict sense. The advice as he gives it is definitely sound.
The sixth common world building mistake I see new fantasy writers make is to treat their world as being static. One of the big world building lessons I learned from writing my interactive fantasy novel, Siege of Trebelin, is to treat your world as a liquid rather than as a solid. Oftentimes, fantasy writers default to creating worlds that feel very static and unchanging, where everything is just locked in a kind of medieval stasis and the world doesn't really look so different now compared to when it was 1,000 years ago. And now, don't get me wrong, that can be the right approach for some stories. But when I was writing Siege of Trebelin, I really wanted to create a very dynamic world where your decisions as the player character have significant consequences. So by the end of that story, your city could be destroyed by the enemy army, or maybe you have defeated the enemy instead. There are religious disputes, and maybe they have torn your city apart. Or perhaps you figured out how to solve them in a peaceful way. The relationships you have with other characters as well, they could go in a direction where they either flourish or they turn really sour. The changing of your world, the recontextualizing of things, the destruction of things, the creation of things, that can actually be an incredibly powerful tool to produce emotion in your story. I think that Joe Abercrombie did...
Well, it does feel a little bit more like an inserted commercial for this for this interactive novel than actual writing advice. I would say if you have a static or a dynamic world that depends very much on your fundamental decisions regarding your world building, and one isn't necessarily better than the other. Take Middle-earth, for example. The level of technology they have in the Third Age isn't much different from what's going on in the First Age. And there are like, I think that's about 10,000 year time span or something we're talking here. But the way the machinations of this world have been set by Tolkien, this makes complete sense. For example, the fact that the gods, while distant, are still very much present in this world to some degree, makes it very unlikely for a number of different religions to spring up. So something like Taoism couldn't arise. And people wouldn't start going to look for the elixir of life as the Taoist mystics did. And so they wouldn't come up with black powder. This is a very static world, but I think we all agree that's one of the best worlds ever written. And to me, it's like, again, it comes down to being consequent. So if I've made certain basic decisions that set me on the course for a static world, I have to stick to that, even if it becomes uncomfortable at a later stage, because I would like to have a greater dynamism. Or if I want to have a very dynamic world, then again, I have to set the principles which I work in the right way to make history develop in a certain way that allows for greater change and greater dynamics.
This brilliantly in his Age of Madness series, which basically shows this medieval fantasy world that gets dragged kicking and screaming into a equally brutal industrial age. And people have to deal with the revolution and political turmoil that comes along the way. Change is really the whole point of that story. And even on a smaller level, if you think about Privet Drive...
Well, yes, but Abercrombie is like a very good example of an author who is very true to his principles. Like his metaphysics look like this. Like at first there was this basically conglomeration of two worlds which get kind of ripped apart, and all the magic gets ripped in the one direction, and we're left in our world with a void that is more and more the void of magic, and which begins to look, as the ages passed, more and more like our world. And there is no divine agency, or hardly any. Even the most powerful wizard is struggling to make stuff happen towards later ages, etc. So he has set himself up for a world that would allow something like that, but he seems to have very carefully thought about the core principles that allow for this to happen. And I think this is the core insight we should take from this point.
In Harry Potter, for most of the series, it's a super dreary place. It represents the repression of the Dursley family. But in the last book, when Harry realizes that, hey, I'm leaving Privet Drive for the last time, it recontextualizes our relationship to this place by making Harry oddly emotional about this final parting.
I'm not really sure what this last point has to do with a static world. This seems to come more down to the prior point of like wanting to have realistic characters that the perspective of a character can of course change over time. But what does this have to do with world building? It makes not that much sense to me. It's just, this wouldn't be specific to fantasy. Like if I have a young man or a young person leaving their oppressive home, but then realizing at a later stage, wow, this is the last time, and I may have had fond memories of at least one or two aspects, and strange, I'm feeling a certain kind of sadness now or something. This is all well and good. You can write a believable character like that, but what that has to do with static worlds, I'm not sure. I don't think this point is very coherent, to be honest.
Mistake number 7 is writing boring info dumps. So you probably don't need me to tell you that info dumps suck, but what actually makes a bad info dump? I would say it's when you give readers information that they didn't ask for and have no interest in receiving. What makes a good info dump, on the other hand, is when you give readers information they desperately want. I like to call this the invited info dump. You want to write as...
Again, this is more a stylistic question than a question of world building, if you ask me. Let's see what else he has to say about this.
Many invited info dumps as possible in your story. But let me give you an example of a bad info dump and then a good info dump that actually has this sort of invited approach. First of all, the bad example here. 2 characters are walking through a forest, and you suddenly start telling the reader about the history of this kingdom they live in. You list every single king that's been around for the last 500 years, the various political alliances at play, and the economic structure that your culture uses. But because your characters aren't discussing this information, and it has zero relevance to their current situation, it just feels like an unwanted lecture. Okay, let's fix that example.
Fair enough. This can be incredibly frustrating. Like if you read the Powder Mage series, for example, the author makes the strange decision to have like no beginner level character at first, or the one beginner level character is not involved in a sort of learning process or process of education until the 3rd novel. So you already have all the relevant information that character could have learned very believably, and you end up with very forced and awkward sounding conversations of characters talking about stuff both of them already know, which is only for the benefit of the reader, which makes no sense. And I agree this is frustrating and boring, but what does that have to do with world building? Again, this is more like a question of poor stylistic choices than of actual world building, if you ask me.
Let's imagine that you have 2 soldiers and they're walking through a dangerous forest, and they find the ruins of an ancient battlefield from 500 years ago. Maybe it's like a half-destroyed castle or something. And one character explains to the other that this was where their kingdom's fiercest battle throughout history was fought. And now there's these artifacts that are hidden there, and if they can find them, they might hold some kind of secrets or magical properties that could radically alter the course of the war they're currently fighting. So what's the difference there? Well, you can probably see that your characters have a much better motivation to explain your world building. And as a result, it doesn't feel like an info dump. It just feels like we are progressing the story and maybe revealing something about your characters as well through the way that they are telling that backstory.
This is in principle, good advice. It comes more down to a point he made earlier, I think, of like how you want to have things interconnected, like the character development linked with the history, with the progression of the story, and also with the metaphysics. But it is not a question of world building, strictly speaking. It is a question of stylistic choices, how you reveal the world building to the reader. And if you take the term world building like very, very loosely and say, okay, I'm gonna not only count the actual world building, but also the way the world is presented to the reader, then you could make a case for this point, I guess, to be kind of categorized under world building, but it would be in a very loose sense indeed, I think.
The next big world building mistake is to be writing cultural monoliths. When you're building your fantasy world, it is so tempting to just give different races or cultures one core defining trait. You might have the warrior race, you might have the hippie forest people race, you might have the sneaky merchant traders race. And that can be a good starting point. And for cultures that your reader only has a brief interaction with, that may be okay. But in real life, even the most homogenous cultures contain multitudes in terms of their thinking, their religious attitudes, their social expectations, their goals, personality types, and every other aspect of the human condition. And that complexity, I think, should be a really key part of your world building if you want to make it feel vibrant and real. So if we consider...
Completely agree. Great point. I've grown up with Star Trek and I've never questioned it as a kid when I watched TNG, but like Star Trek is so guilty of this. The Ferengi are the traders and all the Ferengi only care about money. The Vulcans are only logical and their whole perspective on the universe is logical. And the Klingons just want to fight and nothing else. And it's only the humans who have like all of these traits intertwined and who have a kind of a balanced or nuanced outlook on the universe. And this is so trite and boring, and I think he's completely right here.
That warrior culture we just described there, sure, they may say that strength and honor is really pivotal and really important to them, but maybe not everyone in that society thinks the same way, or they disagree on what strength and honor actually looks like. Maybe some people resent the focus on combat and they instead want to pursue more artistic sensibilities, or they want to pursue more diplomatic means to solving their conflicts. And even in the context of war, maybe some warriors value strategy a lot, while others just want to charge in there with brute force. When you can add all these different attitudes and contradictions within a culture, it makes it so much more interesting and realistic. And it also gives you so many more opportunities for conflict and meaningful tension in your story.
Completely agree. Nothing to add here.
And then the next common world building mistake is feeling like you need to know everything about your world before you start writing. I work with a lot of fantasy writers in my different programs. You know, at the moment, I'm wrapping up cohort 4 of my fantasy outlining bootcamp, and we were talking about world building a lot this week. And one of the things that can be difficult as a new writer is feeling like you need to know every single aspect of your world before you can actually start writing that first draft. Now, I am a big advocate of outlining and trying to have a good amount of planning and an understanding of your structure before you dive into a story. But sometimes with world building, you do need to accept that you can fill in a lot of the details later on. And so sometimes I go into stories and I have...
Yes and no, I would say. It depends, I think, very much on what kind of fantasy you want to write. If your idea is, I want to write an immortal work of art, or I just want to write entertainment and make money out of it, then I think that will differ. If you say, I really don't care so much and I just want to get it out there to the readers, I want to get published, I want to be successful, I think you can get away with something like that, like just start writing and fill in the details later, and if it's a little wonky, at the end there are only nerds like me who will really care about it. If your goal is to produce an immortal work of art, I think this will come around and bite you in the ass sooner or later if you don't have your world building very, very clear before you start writing.
I have a super clear idea of all the world building I plan to explore. Other times, things are a little bit sketchier, shall we say. So for example, when I was writing Kingdom of Dragons, there is a sequence in this where Rovan, who is this spy who has infiltrated Elysium, the floating city of the Dragon Riders, to destroy it from within, he basically uses this amulet, and this amulet takes him into a vision of the past so that he can communicate with his master about what he's getting up to on his undercover mission. Now, in the first draft, I knew that I wanted to use those scenes in the amulet to kind of have almost a little backstory of the world's history. And I wanted to showcase this kind of sequence that takes place 700 years ago about these eldritch entities that once ruled the planet of Ahara. And so what I did in the first draft is those scenes where Rovan goes into the amulet and he talks with his master, it was literally just the dialogue. That was it. Then when I'd finished the first draft, I counted up all those scenes, and I think there were 5 or 6 of them off the top of my head, and I did a little mini outline of how I could weave this sub-story through those vision scenes. And then I ended up writing that as its own thing. There have been a lot of readers who've told me that they really enjoyed that backstory and how it made the world feel so much more alive and kind of rich with all this history and lore. But it was not a detail that I had from the very beginning. And actually, there's a lot of key aspects of that world building that are now playing into the second book, as I'm in the process of writing that at the moment. I'm about 75% of the way through the first draft of the sequel. And that is just an example I bring up to show you that you can quite easily figure out a lot of the world building details later on in the process. Now, if you want to learn more unique world building...
Yeah, that may be true, depending on what you want to achieve. But I want to take the title of this last segment, Feeling Like You Need to Know Everything. This is something, and now I'm going to play my trump card, so to speak, where the central problem of this video shows up. Comes back to my point, which I mentioned at the beginning. He never defines what world building actually is. I would like to give you an idea of how I think about world building and how it comes down to this last point he makes. Obviously, you're not a god, and therefore you can never know every individual fact about the universe you're creating. And that's very true. But, and here is I won't call it a counter argument, but I would say this is the point where I think it goes to show that this lack of a systematic approach in this video kind of twists the most important issue that he speaks about here in this last point. While it is true that you cannot know every individual fact, I think what you can do is set out principles that allow you to derive every individual fact in your universe, at least in principle. This is where I would try a first stipulative definition of world building and then explain how I would approach world building once I've established that definition. I will define world building as a conceptual process specific to speculative fiction in which the metaphysical and epistemological core principles of the intended cosmos are set in such a way that the individual facts of cosmology, theology, and history can be consistently derived from them. So, while I will never know every individual story of every hero, every prophet, every god in the pantheon, every facet of the magic system, the web of core principles of metaphysics and epistemology I said at first should be so intricate and so systematic that I can, in principle, form a chain of reasoning which would lead me down to individual outcomes on the different layers, so to speak, of my ontology, where I can say, okay, if this is my starting point, let's say, then I will have a theogony that looks like this, and this will result in the sphere of the gods becoming transparent to created being in such and such a way. That means I have prophets, for example, that will experience the events of the theogony in such and such a way, and that will end up in religions that look like this and that. I will have hopefully a consistent chain of reasoning from very abstract principles leading down to the individual layer with which the characters in the plot are confronted with. And I haven't taught many seminars on this yet, but so far I have to say that, to pat myself on the back a little bit, this approach has worked very well for the writers who've worked with me. Like, we've always found that when I asked them to set out their world building to me, that we always could find like blind spots in their world building where we got to certain points where they just told me, oh, I don't know why it is like that. And by building up the set of core principles, we found that these black spots started to disappear over the days. And In the end, they were able to form their own principles and without my help come to conclusions on how that would affect the world and the world history of their settings. This is, to bring it back to the beginning of the video, this is the central problem I see in the approach this creator has taken to world building, that he never seems to have clearly reflected what world building actually is. He then kind of, to use an expression from Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, he just rhapsodically collects the material and says this is all world building, where it's wildly differing aspects of writing, like there are stylistic issues, issues of presentation. There are world building issues in this video, and he makes some great points. And even in those segments of the video where I think they don't have anything to do with world building, he sometimes gives very sound advice. But I think this approach is lacking in rigor and could be improved upon. So much for now. I hope this doesn't come across as too much of an attack or something. That's not my intention. I really want to engage in a discussion here, and I hope those of you who watch this can take away a few points for your own writing and your own approach to world building. If so, please comment which aspects that I mentioned you found helpful. If there is something you disagree with, let's debate in the comments. Would be happy to hear your arguments. If you're curious about more stuff of this kind, then stay around. Like if you're English spoken, I will produce more English videos in the future. And if you're from my German core audience, I hope this wasn't too off-putting that I suddenly start to produce videos in another language. Anyway, if you like it, then please leave a like, follow the channel for more content of this kind. Ceterum censeo, heraldum figulum esse delendum. See you next time.